first step for this was to print out the font I wanted, and I went with HighTower text at 400 point font, and I just used Photoshop to print out sheets of the font I was using for this sign. And this ended up using a 5/16 bushing with an 1/8 inch router bit. You can't go much smaller than this, but you can go larger. I use a 1/16 inch piece of plastic off of an old refrigerator. If I was doing this project again, I would use something no thinner than a 1/4 inch. After ripping my plastics to 6 inches, I marked 3/4 of an inch on either side of the plastic and drew 2 straight lines. Then I went back and added another 1 inch line, which would be where I was going to mount all my stencils. Starting 3/8 of an inch from the edge, I attached all my paper stencils that I cut out with an X-Acto knife. After each letter, I would draw a straight edge right along the edge of the letter and leave a 7/8 inch gap in between the letters to give me some space for cutting it out on my table saw. That 7/8 of an inch gap ended up being too big for the spacing of each letter. So if you're doing this, the final cut on either side of the letter ideally is 1/8 of an inch. Then I used a Sharpie to outline all the letters onto my plastic. I removed the letters before cutting and used the Sharpie marks as a guide just because I have found that sometimes the paper will get caught up in the blades and it's hard to see the cut. Once that was done, I marked centers in between all the letters to cut out on the table saw. And like I said, ideally you'll have 1/8 of an inch on either side of the letter. Then using my miter gauge, I cut out all my letters on the table saw. This blade is not made for cutting plastic, but after a couple test runs through, it wasn't chipping or sending any plastic into my face, so I wasn't cutting a lot with it, and I just went with it. I have a scroll saw that I use about once every year that I was going to cut out these letters with, and after a couple test runs I found it was easiest to pre-drill some circles in all the corners of the letters, because since this is plastic, if you hung out too long in one spot with the blade running, it would melt the plastic. And I went pretty quickly while doing this and just used a file to clean up the letters after they were cut out. Once I had enough patterns cut out, I transferred them onto a scrap piece of wood just to check the spacing of the lettering, and this is where I found out that the original 3/8 inch spacing I had was too big. So with the 3/8 of an inch spacer on either side, we're left with an inch gap in between the letters, which is going to be too big. So I lined up the K over here and kept moving it over. This was a 1/2 inch, this was a 1/4, and it looks like a 1/4 inch in between each letter is going to be what I want. So with this 3/8, in order to get a 1/4 on either side, I'm going to trim these down on either side of all the letters. So now that I have all of my patterns trimmed, so there's about 1/8 of an inch on either side of the letter, I take the bushing that I'm going to use in my router for my pattern and test it on each of the pieces to make sure it will slide. And this one's pretty good. Anywhere that it looks like it's going to stick, like a lot of times in these little corners it will stick, I'll just take my file and run it through there a couple times until it fits in there smoothly. You could see also with the ones with connecting, if you trimmed out all of this, obviously you would have this opening in the P that you'd have to stick onto your template. So I just kept little tick marks connecting all the pieces on the letters that had that, like the G has that, and then once everything's routed out, I'll have to go back and with a chisel take out these little spaces, but it makes it easier than having to realign these pieces every time you want to use the stencils. I cut a scrap piece of cedar 2x8 I had around the shop for my sign, and I did this so that I would have less depth to go through with my router bit, because I was going to make this sign go through the entire piece of wood. And then I just cleaned up the rough cut on the table saw with the hand plane before attaching my pattern. Since this is cedar, there were a lot of knots, and I just filled some of the knot cracks with epoxy to make sure when I routed my pattern the knot didn't catch and rip out and ruin the piece. I drew a straight edge on my cedar and then lined up my first letter on the piece. Once I got that square, I marked all the way down the board that measurement, and then I would draw a straight line across the top of my board, which is what every single letter would line up to. Then I just went through with double-sided tape and attached all the letters using that top line as my guide. So I have my pattern on my wood, and you can't see it anymore, but I drew a straight edge up here, and that's how I lined up all my letters. So I know they're all perfect. And the nice thing about drawing all over the initial pattern is you can tell that you're lined up the whole way because your horizontal will go through each letter. Now I added double-sided tape to the back of all these letters, but it was Scotch tape brand. I don't have this stuff they sell at the hardware store for a router, so I went through and I had this like silky packing tape, which is pretty smooth, and I just put that on the edge. And the only reason I wasn't going to initially do that is because the router base has a tendency to get caught right on this little lip, but if you're careful enough, this should do. So now I'm going to start running my router over this in probably 1/8 inch passes. So in order to route my pattern, I needed a 5/16 bushing, which I have a bushing kit, but I have damaged my 5/16 bushing and I needed a new one. So I didn't want to wait a couple days for something to come in the mail, so I went to my local hardware store, and the only thing they had was this universal switch out style bushing set. It's Craftsman brand, but it's the exact same one you could find on Amazon that's made by Miles Craft. And this gets really good reviews. The biggest complaint I noticed online was these turn lock bushings that come with the set that lock in place. People said get loose sometimes when you're routing, and then the bit gets caught on the brass bushing and the whole piece gets messed. This will get damaged, and then sometimes what you're working on. But I wanted to get this project done today, so I just bought it, and I'll know with that information I'll just keep checking the fit. Playing around with it, they do lock in place pretty tightly, so hopefully I don't have a problem. So what you do to attach this is you take the base off of your old router. This is a Bosch router that I usually use in my router stand, and then with the multitude of holes in the plate, you find ones that align with your mounting holes, and they provide bolts, but the bolts were too big, so luckily I always have this sort of kit laying around, and I use the bolts because the bolts that came with the router are too short because this plastic is thicker than the original base. I also added some washers to kind of distribute the weight when you tighten down these bolts on plastic. And I'm in the slotted screws, so you use this centering pin with one of the bushings in place and center it, and then you can tighten down your screws. Then you could take this out, take out the centering pin, and I'll put the 5/16 bushing in and the down cut spiral bit that I'm using to cut my pattern. Even though the base I got for this was not an optimal piece of equipment, it worked well enough, and the main catalyst behind it was that the plexiglass made it much easier to see my pattern while routing out everything. So I just did one pass at a 1/4 inch, and if this depth is okay with you, you could take the letters off and you'd be done. You can see that the straight bit leaves a nice flat bottom on all the patterns. I did not have a problem with the base I added to my router by going in after every couple letters and just making sure this was tight. I could see how it could be a problem. There's a little tab in here that I imagine if you're changing these out frequently kind of wears down and it comes out, but I didn't have a problem. But one thing I will say is my pattern was a 1/16 of an inch, and the tips of most of these bushings are more than 1/16 of an inch. So my bit was kind of riding on top of my pattern. I ended up filing this down a little bit so that it would work. I don't highly recommend that. It worked fine for me, but hacks like that, it's kind of do at your own risk sort of thing. So if I was to do this again, I would make my pattern material thicker so that I wouldn't have that problem with my bushing. Other than that, it worked out fine.
One day we might have a big house with nice cars and fancy clothes.